So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Saint Lucia Basketball Federation Athlete Development Workshop 7. And this is being presented by the Saint Lucia Basketball Federation and Supporting Girls in Sports. For this 7th workshop, we have our presenter for today being Miss Marlene Holmes. And Marlene Holmes is the CEO and founder of the BFCA Experience. The BFCA Experience focuses on athlete success beneath the jersey by providing tools that prepare, support, and motivate players, parents, and coaches beyond the game. Now, before we begin and I leave the rest to Ms. Holmes, I wanted to provide y'all with a little background information about our facilitator today. So Ms. Holmes is a former Division I volleyball player who is now a social worker and entrepreneur. Ms. Holmes has mastered the art of utilizing her athletic training to adapt and contribute to social work and athletics. While attending Bethune-Cookman University, she earned a bachelor's degree in sociology with a social work minor and completed her master's degree at the University of Central Florida. Ms. Holmes currently attends Barry University as a third-year doctoral student in social work, focusing on Black female collegiate athletes' lived experience. She has presented at numerous conferences and organizations, including Jack and Jill of America, the Alliance of Social Workers in Sports, Association for Applied Sport Psychology, Black Student Athlete Summit, and more. She also takes time to speak to current high school athletes, college students, and collegiate athletes at the University of Texas, Austin, Millspa College, West Boca Raton High School, and more. She was recently honored as the recipient of the Doctoral Fellowship Award at Barry University for her dedication to bring awareness to social work and athletics. She continues to share her journey and research via podcasts, interviews, magazine features, and recent publication in 99 Point Magazine. We are so happy to have her here as well as a facilitator today, and I welcome Ms. Marlene Holmes, our facilitator today.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled and thankful to be here. So thank you to all for welcoming me, for inviting me to this platform. My hope today is that you all are able to take some new information, apply it to your population, apply it to your lives, to continue to support and help our athletes in any chapter of their life. As you all know, and if you don't know, today we're going to focus on life after sports. And what I think is important to understand is that when we talk about life after sports and that transition, it really starts before the athletic career concludes. So we're going to talk about information that is going to support players, coaches, parents, former athletes, current athletes. And the reason I say that is because as a former athlete myself, there's a lot of information that I did not realize that was relevant to my journey because I did not have the knowledge. My mother did not have the knowledge, and I can say it's safe to assume that some of my coaches didn't have the knowledge. So it's important that we realize that we are impacting the lives of these players. And in order to do that, you have to understand the thought process and the emotional development or the lack of emotional development, which will impact the way our athletes communicate, how they view themselves and how they view others. And also for those of us that are working within the athletic community, that will also impact our lens on how we see the athletes, how we see their challenges, how we see their successes, the pressure we put on them, the expectations. So we're going to talk about all of that, and I'm going to take you through a journey. And by all means, if you have questions, we will definitely have a Q&A at the end, and I may call on some of you to interact and we'll just utilize the chat to make it easier. If you have any questions, we'll get to a point where I may want you to give me your feedback or what you may assumed to be in that section. So one of the main things to focus on when we talk about life after sports, and that transition chapter is what is known as athletic identity. So I'm actually entering my 4th year of my doctoral program. I'm now a doctoral candidate, so almost done with the degree. And what I found in my research early on was the term athletic identity. And as a former athlete, I had never heard this term. But as I read the literature and prepared to do my own research, I realized that the ego and the emotional detachment that many athletes experience when it comes to the sport can definitely impact negatively our experience, and specifically for Black athletes. There's a researcher named Lipchap, and he states that for the Black athletes specifically, our transition out of sports can be extremely detrimental to our mental and emotional development because of how much we are attached and we identify with the sport. So if you have not heard the term athletic identity, this is simply saying that the athletic presence and your experience of being an athlete is how you identify yourself. So for a lot of us, and I will use myself as example, from 7th grade through graduating college, I was known as the volleyball player. I was known as the track runner. I was known as the tennis player when I got to college. So growing up, as many of us do, I played every sport possible. In high school, volleyball was the sport that stuck because we did not have a tennis team in Alaska. I'm from a military family, but when I got to college, I was able to walk on. So I was able to maneuver through life. And I was an athlete that pretty much anything that I wanted to attempt in regards to sports, I was able to accomplish. I was never cut from a team. I was never not able to have some type of progress based on the goal that I was set. So if you think about that, and you think about the opposite of that for some athletes, that they never quite hit those goals, or we have an unexpected injury that concludes their career. You have to think about how that separation and now how the conclusion of their career is abruptly disrupted, and how who they are is torn away from them. So that's the concept of athletic identity. So for many of our athletes, we have to talk about ego. For many of our coaches and our parents, we have to have an honest conversation about ego. What does it look like? Do we realize that it exists? And how do we navigate in that space for what it is that we're trying to do, whether we're trying to support our players or we're actually the athlete trying to perform? So your ego is a cup full of opinions and speculations that have been filling over the years about who you think you are, most often a false sense of self. So for many athletes, athletic identity is a cloak of protection, because we are sometimes, not all the time, protected by this community of athletics. Now, many of us know that sometimes being an athlete is not always what it is cracked up to be, and it can be challenging, and that space is not always supportive. But still, the fact that you are attached to a school, a program, a university, even on the professional level, there's some sense of protection, and in some situations, entitlement, that you don't really have the opportunity to be your authentic self, because you have to show up and perform every day as an athlete, whether it's in practice, whether it's in class, whether it's in your social circle. And a lot of times we're not always getting the truth of what we need about ourselves and our personal development. So that's something to think about with ego. Then we have the emotional attachment. So as an athlete transitions, their emotional attachment will separate from the sport. So you have to think about how often we hear athletes use their sport as a coping mechanism. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so this is the other side of my brain as a social worker and as a sports social worker. When I talk to my athletes, and right now we have a program called PASS, which is for 9th through 12th graders, and we provide academic support and athletic development support. And what we find is that when we ask our athletes, when they don't do well in the test, because we provide tutoring, what do you do to, besides studying more, besides going out and shooting some free throws, what do you do to recenter yourself and to remind yourself that you are intelligent, that you can pass this exam, giving yourself those positive affirmations? And many of our athletes don't have that outlet, or in social work, we call them protective factors. So the emotional detachment, when that sport leaves, physically, a part of their emotional development leaves, because that sport has given them so much of rewards and satisfaction and sometimes instant gratification. So you think about that. If I win, everyone loves me. If I don't win, everyone's mad at me. If I miss the winning shot, everyone's going to talk about that when I get to school the next day. All of that is within that athlete experience. You take that away, and now you have a person or a second identity that's never been explored. So for athletic identity, the hierarchy says that a lot of us identify as an athlete first, especially our Black men on the top, and then second, our Black women. We typically attach to the sport the most. And then the hierarchy continues to go with other races and other genders. And so once that's taken, it's almost like the Band-Aid is ripped off and we have other identities, gender and race, and in some situations, sexuality that we have not explored because it's been covered with athletic identity. So again, when we're talking about life after sports, we have to have moments to talk to our athletes and peel back these layers and say, who are you at your core? Do you know who you are? What has their past been? What is their present situation? And where is it that they are trying to go? Because so often we find that through theories, and forgive me, I can't remember the exact theory at this moment, but there's a theory that proves that majority of Black athletes that go into top 10 universities usually end up, unfortunately, going back to the community that is lower income, inner city, because they were not supported or given the opportunities in the same magnitude that their non-Black colleagues and our athletes were. So it's called a reproductive system where we come into this process of sports and then we do what we have to do. We graduate with a degree that doesn't necessarily give us what we need to succeed. And it sends us right back into the community that we try to come out of. So again, something to think about as a parent, as a player, as a coach. What are we doing to develop our athletes for the future? We cannot prepare for life after sports, their senior year of high school, their senior year of college, the year they decide to retire. It's not that it's too late, but it's not going to be as productive as it could have been if we were more prepared. So on this slide, we talk about the mental and emotional development that contributes to athletic identity. So what we have in the literature and the research, two terms have been created. I did not coin these terms, self-identity and self-concept. And they're two different experiences, but they absolutely overlap. So if anyone in the chat is an athlete or has played sports before, I want you to think about this a little bit. And if you're a coach or you have athletes in your family, think about self-identity as an athlete. And what self-identity states is that awareness, this is when the athlete is aware of who they are in a social space. So example, it can be in the classroom, it can be amongst their social group, their friends, it can be if they have a job. Who are they in that space? So for many of us, we know that on campus, we are the athlete and people label us as the athlete, as the volleyball player, as the tennis player, and you are just naturally aware of that. It can also go to race and gender. When I show up to a space, I know that I'm Black and I know that my majority surrounding in many settings does not look like me. It doesn't minimize my impact or contribution, but it does cause me to navigate in a way to where I have to be aware and make sure that I'm able to execute in all the points. And also safety goes into that. We have to think about different areas in our communities and where our athletes come from, and then where they're going, and are they prepared for that as well? Many of our athletes come from communities that look just like them, whether it's a Black community or it's a white community or a Latinx community, that's where they are. So when you take that athlete into a university or a program or anything of that matter, and that's something they have not been exposed to, that can be challenging. And you think about the emotional impact that yet again, we don't discuss. So if you think again about life after sports, we have all of these experiences, all of these emotions that are bottled up that we can't articulate. And when I say we, I'm speaking of athletes that we can't articulate, we don't know that they exist, and those continue to carry, and I use the word marinate over time. And then that's when we see mental health. That's when we see depression. That's when we see our athletes becoming dependent on some type of substance in order to cope and to push through. Not saying that all athletes are that is common for addiction, but we see behaviors that could have possibly been another route if given that opportunity and explored. The other concept we have is self-concept. And so views of self are influenced from external interactions. So this is basically saying that for many athletes, external validation is pivotal in our day-to-day activity. And for many athletes, you'll ask them, do you care what other people think about you? And it will depend on their level of play. It would depend on if they are a starter or if they're a bench warmer. It would depend on maybe what level of athletics they're in, Division I, Division III, JUCO, which is junior college. It just depends. But I have not met one single athlete that has not had a bad game or a bad experience that doesn't linger into class. It doesn't linger into their home life, because we're so programmed and conditioned, and it's not intentional. It's just how it's been, unfortunately, but it can definitely change. That we know and we attach who we are, our value to the sport, and we feel that we let others down if we don't succeed. And so you can imagine the pressure that is placed on with many athletes. And then again, with race and gender, the pressure is sometimes doubled, is sometimes considered a triple threat, as W.E. Du Bois has mentioned in his research. Okay. So I like to talk about this specifically, as Ms. Marie shared earlier. My research focuses specifically on the Black female athlete experience. For my dissertation, it's the Black female collegiate athlete experience. And so in order to do that, there's a lot of reading that has taken place, and I've been thankful for the opportunity because it really allowed me to unpack my journey and to make sure that when I talk to young athletes or even former athletes, that we're able to start and break down that experience. So these are 3 layers. When we talk about athletic identity and we talk about transition, these are the 3 main points that I introduce all of my athletes to. And obviously I will adapt based on gender, based on race, based on different things they are coming to me with. But for many of our Black athletes, these are the key areas that we have to talk about. And specifically when we're addressing women, talking about intersectionality. And again, for me, I believe in the power of education because I did not know how complex the history of knowing Kimberly Crenshaw, of knowing a lot of researchers in this area, of knowing bell hooks that can really explain what the journey has been historically to understand why we are in a space today. We've all been watching the news, we've all been following track and field, and there's a lot to unpack versus what we say in the athletic community versus what spectators say about the sport. But you have to know your history to know how sometimes detrimental comments and things can be made towards athletes, towards women specifically, and again, towards Black women, and as well, of course, as Black men. So the journey of Black female athletes is defined through our layers. And so one thing that we have to explore and be aware of is historical trauma and current systemic oppression systems that we have within athletic programs, universities, and things of that nature. So depending on what we're doing and where we're working at, this approach can be effective, but if you're not educated in this area, you can do more harm than good. But I believe that for our coaches and for the universities that you work at or the different programs, it's important that you know the history of that program, who established it, who is the founder, what was the initial development of their program, who was included, who was allowed to participate in sports, because that is an underlying attitude that carries through history that we often don't talk about. And it's critical that we do that because that often will determine the education route, the finances, and just overall support that we have for our athletes. And with intersectionality, when I talk about the athletic identity and the hierarchy, with intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw, they're focusing on the marginalization of Black women in society in many different areas. And for example, we can just say with education, there are statistics that show that Black young girls between high school and middle school are more likely, or I believe 3 times more likely to get suspended, where their non-Black counterparts are maybe less than 1 as far as suspensions and discipline for the same occurrence. So it's something to think about when we come into our sports. And we can see that as an athlete, certain athletes are permitted to do certain things. We can use Simone Biles as an example, that she is, the greatest gymnast of all time, as many have said. and her skill level is so advanced to where she is not given the opportunity to be scored based on her talent. Instead, she does not get the full capacity. She doesn't get the opportunity. In fact, sometimes it has been deducted for her talent. And so the question lies, if this was a non-Black athlete, would that same situation happen? Would the same conversation be that she's overperforming, she's doing too much, she's too quick, she's winning too much, which is a conversation that has been had, and Simone Biles has actually said herself that she has been told that individuals within the gymnast community feel that she is winning too much. When have we ever heard of anyone wanting an athlete to slow down with winning? We wouldn't play sports if that was the case. All right. And so also when we talk about the barriers that impact the transition, so again, talking about life after sports, and this is so relevant as we still are going through the pandemic, that we need to understand that what the dynamics of our athletes' relationships with their family, with their friends, with their coaches, with their teammates, that a lot of our players are dealing with grief. A lot of our coaches are dealing with grief, losing parents, families, and friends. And so how does that impact them in the game? What happens when you lose your grandparent who was the main cheerleader and the main person financially supporting you through the sport, and now they're no longer here? Who is having that conversation with that athlete? Who is checking in to make sure they're okay and not asking, did you go and run your 2 miles under 7 minutes today? No, I'm sorry, not 2 miles, 1 mile under 7 minutes. No one's having that conversation. And so I really encourage, again, those in the athletic community, that you're stopping and you're taking a step back to talk to the athlete as a person. Sometimes we have to put the jersey to the side and remember that we are developing people. And so that human development side, that emotional development side is critical. And we absolutely fall short in that area. Making sure that you have resources, whether it's on your campus and your community. There's so many programs and companies, including myself, that you can connect with to provide support. And I always say, if I can't find it, I will find someone in another organization that can support you. So here we see the structure where we have the athletic identity, which we're all clear on now. We have grief and we have denial. So depending on where you are in your journey, grief is very common and denial is usually ranked 1 or 2 commonly amongst athletes, when they're transitioning. So when we say denial, for a lot of athletes, the acceptance of career conclusion, whether it's retirement, whether it's graduation, whether it's an injury that has ended their career, the denial sometimes is so heavy that it can take years to accept the transition, and it will present in different ways. So sometimes denial can lead obviously to mental health, which we see over here, but it's because of the loss of structure and the loss of support. And so it will manifest. And I can give an example again with myself, that it took about 10 years after I graduated to really process and understand that, wow, my exit from sports was slightly traumatic. And slightly is an understatement. For me, the coach that helped me get from my junior college to my Division I program, which is Bethune-Cookman University, was 36 years old and lost her battle with stage 4 cancer. So I graduated my sophomore year. By the summer, she was diagnosed. And 2 years later, about 3 days before my senior match, the last game of my career, she died of cancer. So that was a huge hit, right? But we still had season. I still had to play, went to her funeral, came back for our MEAC, which is our conference tournament, which we made it to. And I didn't play in the last game of my career. And so years later, talking to my coach, because obviously I was traumatized for many different reasons, she shared that she did not have the ability to articulate how to support me, how to approach and ask questions. So that is a perfect example how our coaches don't have the education, the insight, or the resources, more importantly, because it would have been great if she was able to connect me with a therapist or a social worker to help me go through that. So I will safely say for my senior year in college, I battled depression. Here I lost the person that helped me get to college. I had other family deaths that happened. It was very challenging. And so I ran from the sport. I was not interested in playing rec ball. I was not interested in playing beach ball, because what was the point in my mind? And so that comes from the emotional detachment. And so we have to be aware of that. And then what our athletes are dealing with a lot now is with our mental health challenges and self-medicating. I highly encourage to either connect with mental health organizations, mental health providers, so that we can understand how to identify and connect our athletes. For many communities, mental health is cliche, but anxiety is very real. Depression is real. Suicidal thoughts is real. Suicide attempts are real. We recently saw an athlete, a Black male, commit suicide, who his parents said that he was perfectly fine the previous day, smiling, happy, and no red flags. So you just never know. So having those resources, having the ability to check in with athletes outside of the sport is critical. Okay. And so this is just tapping a little refresher with the athletic identity. Again, strong connection of self can create both positive and negative outcomes for the athletes. So we're going to watch a quick video from Dr. Brene Brown. I'm a little biased because she is a social worker. Let me go forward and then come back to see if it plays. Okay. And so in this video, she's going to talk about vulnerability. I'm not sure what, there we go. She's going to talk about vulnerability. And this is very important. So I would like you to kind of listen to it. And in the comments, as she's talking or when she concludes, just share with me if you agree, disagree with what she's saying when we're talking about vulnerabilities. And again, what she's saying, apply it to the athlete and their transition.
Advocating for people to just put it all out there.
No, I'm saying, all I'm saying about vulnerability is that when you are in uncertainty, when you feel at risk, when you feel exposed, don't tap out. Stay brave, stay uncomfortable, stay in the cringy moment, lean into the hard conversation, and keep leading. Stay brave. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying you need to overshare. I'm not saying you need to disclose. I'm not saying you need to weep uncontrollably to show how human you are. I'm saying try to be aware of your armor. And when you feel vulnerable, try not to transform up. Try to stay human, keep leaning. Very different things.
All right, if anyone could write in the chat for me if you agree, disagree, if that makes sense, so I can know. I would like to dissect a little more with the video, but I want to see, did that connect with anyone? Did anyone feel what she's talking about when she's saying sit in the moment, don't run from it? And so we're talking about transition, and I talked about my exit. I ran from it. I didn't want to explore the sadness, the disconnect, the loss of community and team and all of that. I didn't want to discuss that because I wasn't prepared for it. Okay. So the next thing we have is what we call, it's something that I've created, is called the playbook, and it's the power of self-talk. And so these are 3 pillars that we work with all of our athletes with to ensure that they are able to develop a foundation. Also, I call them the 3 pillars for development and support during the transition. You have to find something that motivates you in life. And often you can use the same thoughts, the same emotions that motivated you to go to practice, to be committed with working out, to be committed with eating well, to being committed with setting boundaries with peers, to know that I can't go to this party because I have a game tomorrow, right? What keeps you motivated, and explore that discipline. So that taps into self-control. A lot of our athletes, we are just programmed and we produce and we execute, but it's self-control and it's discipline. So again, those same behaviors and techniques and day-to-day awareness that a lot of our athletes don't realize, you are in tune with yourself. We just haven't talked about it. And then being focused. What are your goals? And a lot of times my athletes don't have major goals. And that is why I do what I do. What are you good at? What are you interested in? Let me introduce you to different things that are in the world. For I used to say that I'm not your typical social worker, but I am your typical social worker. I have found an opportunity to not only develop my own business with the BFCA experience, but also be able to work in different organizations of Fortune 500 companies to develop curriculum, to train staff, to educate them. I started out in healthcare. I've been a therapist for clients that struggle with addiction. I've worked with young kids with residential and mental health. So I've been able to take all of that and navigate in any space and use those resources to market myself. So I'm able to help athletes build a plan based on my own journey to say that anything is possible if you want to do it. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean you won't experience racism or sexism. Doesn't mean that you won't experience where you're not paid what you deserve, but I can assure you that I can give insight so you don't have to go through what I went through, or I can at least support you through that process and let you know that it does get better. So with the playbook specifically, this is what the procedures are that we have our athletes go through. And again, this is my social work practice. I'm a huge advocate in writing. A lot of my athletes don't like to write. They think it's pointless. Why? But what we find is once they start writing, it just comes out. It's easier for our athletes to sometimes articulate through song, through music, through art, through play therapy. So we have to be creative. And what we say is meet our client or meet our athlete where they're at. So allow them to be expressive in their own way and go through that journey together with them on these 3 pillars. Write what makes you motivated, sing about what makes you motivated, draw what makes you motivated, whatever that is for you. And we go through the 1, 2, 3 process for each pillar. So write, apply, meaning that you actually need to figure out what part of your life you need to improve on, what motivates you. What part of your life do we need to increase the capability and the ability to focus? And then when we say practice, we're actually meaning demonstrate it. So when we say playbook, I use a lot of athletic terminologies and experience so that they can say, again, these are the same skills I developed on the court, in the field, and now I can use it in my day-to-day life. There are so many skills that our athletes don't recognize that we, as their support system, have to help them pull it out. And not only that, but to develop it and know how to market it. It's not enough to just go into a job interview and say that I'm a former Division I athlete. That's great, but what about that experience and what can you bring to the team? Right now, there are hundreds and thousands of athletes applying for jobs and looking for the next chapter, but what makes you stand out differently? And so we work on that and talk about that as well. And then we have the power of self-reflection. So as we go through as we go through the write process, the practice, and the apply process, these are some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves. And so when I say we, it's the dialogue that I'm having with my athletes, with parents, and with coaches. So we apply. Am I prepared? Why or why not? So if you're a coach, you have to sit back and you have to be strategic about what you're doing for your players. We all know that there are statistics and money and requirements and APR for our athletes to graduate. If an athlete does not graduate from college, that's not a good thing. So are you prepared? But are you doing more than just what you have to do to check the box? So are you prepared? Why or why not? Is this a space for you? Do you need resources? Do you have help? Same thing for the athlete. Are you prepared for the transition? Have you thought about it? Why or why not? And we just go through these questions to support them. And I think the most important question we have here is an athlete asking themselves, can I be honest with myself? Can they really say that they're scared about never being able to play a sport on this level again? Can they really say that they're going to miss the brotherhood or sisterhood of being on the team? Do they feel vulnerable enough to say that, or do they see that as a weakness? So we have to start dissecting that and building that self-esteem within many of our athletes. Folks naturally assume that our athletes have high self-esteem and they are confident and they do all of that, but that is all attached to the athletic identity. So again, stripping off that layer and talking about life without being attached to the sport. And so the next few slides, as we get closer to the end, is talking specifically about key transferable skills. So these are some of the most common skills that most of us tell our athletes or that we experience. That as a former athlete or current athlete, you have excellent communication. And depending on your sport, communication can be everything. As a volleyball player, we had to talk to each other or you would run into each other or the ball would hit the floor or someone would get hurt. So communication is essential. What about calling plays? And different ways to communicate. All of that is essential when we talk about the next chapter. Setting goals, knowing your role on the team. Not everyone's a star player. Some people are going to be on the bench. But what is your role and how you contribute? Not everyone on the job is a manager or director, but how do you contribute to that team? Do you still show up on time? Do you still perform your job at 100%? Do you still step in when there's vacant spots and they need flexibility and staff to assist? Same concept, same process, same emotions when we talk about athletes. And so these are some of the top key roles based on what I've seen with research and literature with those that I've interviewed for my dissertation. Observer and strategist roles. And so what this is saying is that on a team, there's usually someone or several folks that have excellent communication skills, and they have the ability to make great decisions. A lot of times we'll see this person as the team captain or co-captain, that they can communicate what the team's frustrations are and take that to the coach, and the coach listens and they trust that player, and vice versa. A lot of times people think, oh, well, that's just, what they've been told to do. But for a lot of us, that is an innate characteristic that we have, that you see team cohesion, you understand the importance of community and listening and tapping in when people feel unseen or unheard. So again, if any of you are athletes or your coaches, start to evaluate what your players look like, and if this is one of their characteristics and one of their roles, because this is a strength that they can build on for life after sports. The next is the cheerleader. And we have men and women cheerleaders. So we want to make sure that we understand that when we talk about this role specifically, this is more of the athletes that are not in the spotlight, that are not on TV, in the articles, on the court playing. An example I use most recently is the Olympics. For a lot of sports, they had a roster, but only a few, 5 or 7 folks, depending on the sport, were actually playing. But I never saw a team that wasn't cheering, that wasn't supporting and rooting those that are on the court. So again, the same thing as we transition, but most importantly, can our athletes be their own cheerleader? And a lot of them don't know how to do that. And we want to support them in that, or let them know that they have a support system through that process. And the last one that I'll talk about is a problem solver. Usually, depending on your sport, you are able to see an athlete that is very, has excellent critical thinking skills, can really resolve an issue before it becomes a huge altercation, whether verbal or physical. And so we want to evaluate that, because that is a huge characteristic and marketable ability when someone can say they are a problem solver, setting goals, they can assess what the potential issue would be if it was not addressed in a certain way. And again, when we think of how do we win games, how do we beat teams, how do you beat someone in an individual sport, you have to problem solve, you have to prepare, you have to study your opponent in order to succeed, you have to anticipate. And these are all, again, characteristics that a lot of our athletes don't recognize, okay? And last but not least, I think, so second to last slide, this is what I've developed as a roadmap of internal and external skills. And this is just saying that look on this chart and recognize that these are just a few, not all, that contribute to who an athlete can be as a successful athlete in life after sports. So all of these are characteristics and skill sets and daily practices that we have when we are actively playing, that are all transferable to the next chapter. So the ability to be commitment to the sport, preparation, organizing, being a forward thinker, constant evaluator. These are things that we do naturally when we play the sport. And again, it took me about 10 years and then going for my doctorate to really dissect this and to understand, wow, I believe this is why I've been able to be successful, because I've been able to tap into these spaces, and then having kind of the knowledge as a social worker, I just maneuver a little differently. So it's now my duty and my responsibility to come into spaces like this and to give insight and give support so that we can better serve our athletes. And so just a recap in conclusion, we want to make sure that we self-evaluate what our athletes enjoy most about athletics. So when we're preparing for the next stage, recap, you want to talk about the good times, you want to talk about the challenging times, but that way they can realize that, okay, I was successful, I enjoyed this, and that's still possible in the next chapter of my life. Is just going to be in a different setting. That could even be in coaching. Coaches will tell you that it's a totally different dynamic than playing, but if that is their purpose and what they're called to do, it's still fulfilling. It's just in a different approach in a different way. Accept the shift and eliminate external evaluation, but ignite to internal motivation. So somewhere in that challenge, and a lot of times this is through therapy, through support, through mentors, that we have to somehow let go of the need to feel valued by our clothing. So when you're an athlete at a college, your athletic attire that you wear when you go to class or around campus, that gave value, that gave status as an athlete, no matter what level you're playing on. So now that you don't have that, we have to learn how to let that go and to have the positive affirmations and the self-fulfillment within ourselves. And it doesn't have to come from anyone else. And then as we go into the last few steps, is taking control of your path and effectively utilizing mentors. I believe that athletes in transition absolutely have to have a mentor. There is a lot of things going on in the news right now with track. And I firmly believe that if some of our athletes had mentors, a lot of this could be navigated differently and supported. But you also have to remember that we have to meet our athletes where they are as well. And not everyone is ready for a mentor, but it's definitely effective if we're able to provide that assistance and that service. Don't limit yourself to just athletic spaces. Go beyond your comfort zone. Never in a million years would I've imagined that I've been able to do what I'm doing. Like I'm in California right now, working with a major Fortune 500 company as they go through a transition of encompassing new contracts. And I'm here training their staff and developing their curriculum. And that is through my journey as a social worker that I've learned those skills, but also as an athlete, I've been able to adapt and assess my room, anticipate issues and be able to market that and to get contracts. And it's been phenomenal. Again, this is nothing that was planned. That was someone gave me the keys and the inside scoop. I had to learn and build and develop because I knew there was opportunities for me. And I'm able to share that with others. And last but not least, remember that failure is a part of the process. There is a gray area outside of athletics. Unfortunately, for many of our athletes, we know life to be win or loss. There's no in between. And that's where we see a lot of shortcomings. That is also where we see mental health come into play. So we need to let our athletes know that in life, if you don't get the job, if you lose a friendship, if you lose a relationship, it is not the end of the world. It's not a loss. It's a lesson, and we have to learn how to build from that. So I think that's one of the biggest things that we can give our athletes is letting them know that failure is okay. And it happens to everyone, even though you may not see it on social media. And if you can push through that with the support system, you will absolutely be able to succeed. All right, and that is it for me. Are there any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions I can answer. No questions?
Hello, me again. So, when you spoke about athletic identity, you mentioned about basically when you're an athlete, that basically becomes so linked to who you are, and possibly after you kind of just left there. What is some advice you have for athletes in regards to separating themselves as an athlete as an individual? So when they maybe don't have as much of that athletic part, they have something.
Absolutely. And so in social work, we actually call those protective factors. So those are coping skills, outlets that you have outside of the sport. So I believe that very early on, so when a athlete, whenever they start a sport, 7th grade, 6th grade, 5th grade, whenever they start a sport, and many parents don't know this and we don't think about this, we need to develop other areas of coping skills to develop us as young people. So if that's joining a debate team, something separate to support you with the academics and let you know that academics is just as important as sports, we can find that balance, because at the end of the day, we are student athletes, but that student component gets missed a lot. So I think earlier on, developing outlets and having friends outside of sports. Many times our teammates are our friends and our family. So I'm very big, especially when our athletes get to college, joining organizations and clubs and going to events that are with non-athletes, right? So joining student government associations, if you decide to pledge, just something that's not attached to athletics, because once you transition, you're not going to be attached to the sport anymore. If you're not going pro, people won't know that you played a sport unless you told them, or unless you're really tall and they just assume that you played a sport. So I think that's the biggest thing, is developing your academic, intellectual development outside of the sport, and having a circle and a support system outside of the sport is going to be valuable, because you have to remember your athletic career can change at any moment. Whether you're in high school and you're looking for a scholarship and you don't get it, whether an injury happens and you don't get it. We saw a lot of athletes with COVID that decided not to go back to school, one, because they felt that it really didn't matter anymore based on what was happening in life. Two, they were not able to go back to school because they were losing family members and had to help support their family. So now again, the sport is gone, and who am I now that it's gone, in the support system? So great question. And I think that's the most effective way. Develop yourself outside of the sport world. Earlier, the better. Great question. Any other questions? Feel free to write in the chat. Don't be shy. Okay. Well, thank you for allowing me in this space. I hope that everyone was able to take something away from the presentation. I am here if you ever have questions. I'm sure that Supporting Girls in Sports, or Miss Marie, can share my contact information with you, my website. I'll put all of this in the chat as well, make it a little bit easier. You can find all of our services that we provide on my website. So again, we have an academic and tutoring program for athletes here that are in 9th to 12th grade. For my athletes that are outside of the United States, we're doing our case by case to make sure we can support them, because I'm still having to educate myself on, different areas and what the journey is for them and some of the challenges they're presenting with. So it's also why I'm very thankful to be in this space, because I know for especially our female athletes in the Caribbean, it can definitely be more challenging to pursue certain sports and certain opportunities. Let's see, we have a question. Have you met any athletes who have a difficult time transitioning? Is this in a particular sport? Absolutely, great question. So athletes across the board, their experiences are different. So I think one of the first things you have to be mindful of is not to generalize everyone's experience. You can't say that all Black athletes go through this, or all Black women or all Black men go through this, or all white athletes go through this. You can't do that. So the transition all depends on what their journey has been, where they're going, and what they have been through. So the most common difficult thing that I've come across and that literature shows is just the acceptance and the preparation for the transition. Simply put, just accepting that it's over. Who wants to do that? It's so heavy and so harsh, because we haven't done anything. Everyone's been avoiding that conversation. And now we're forced to accept it. And that's more detrimental than having that conversation. I believe, especially with our high school athletes that are in that 10th, 11th, and 12th, and then when they get to college, we need to talk about the transition now, especially when they're a freshman in college. I believe that during that preseason, when we're doing our conditioning and all of that, that we also need to have a conversation about, what is your game plan? What are you planning to do? We're going to get you out of here in 4 years. That's what your scholarship is for. What's the game plan? But a lot of times we don't talk about that, and the services are there, but we don't know. And a lot of times we're not told either. Is this in a particular sport? It varies. I will say for mental health, studies show that with track and field, mental health is very high. In sprinters, it's a little different than cross country, but both are very taxing. And if you've ever run track, you can imagine why the mental health can be, as far as the anxiety and the depression, let's say for cross country, because of what it physically and emotionally and mentally takes to compete at that level. And I also ran cross country in high school, and that's why I stopped as a freshman, because it's just, I don't know how people do it. It's a lot of work. But we see, with eating disorders as well, within cross-country runners is very common because of the ability, the wanting to perform, and then also the image specifically for women that they face. And a lot of people don't know that eating disorders are very common for cross-country runners. And then you have with our sprinters, physically what that is, emotionally as well on their journey, depending on what it is. So track has a high study of mental health with anxiety and depression for sure. Obviously in other sports, it just varies, but I can say statistically, track and field is one of the highest. One more question. When does an athlete know it's time to move on? Is there a sign? I think it just varies. You know, if you're forced to accept it, meaning that you're graduating or you've been injured, that's your sign, right? You tore your ACL, that's your sign. We got to figure something else out. But also I've worked with freshmen coming into college that just don't enjoy the sport anymore. They've been playing for so long. I've experienced friends that were phenomenal track runners, were on their way to be pro, and their junior year in college, they said, I'm done, I don't want to do this anymore, and just left the sport. And I was like, are you kidding me? But that was years before I did the research to understand what that emotional journey has been for them from third grade to being 20 years old. That's a long time to be forced, in a sense, because she never was passionate about it. She did it because her mom wanted her to do it. It was a family thing. She's from Florida, which is huge. And she was really good, but it wasn't necessarily something she was passionate. So she made a decision to become a gymnast at a Division I, or cheerleader, excuse me, at a Division I university, because she was that good. She could do backflips and splits. And so she was able to do that. But her sign was, I'm not happy. So I also think that we have to honor athletes' emotions. And when they're saying they're not happy, when they're not sure if they want to do this, we don't dismiss that. We don't say, oh, you're just homesick because you're a freshman. We really have an honest conversation with them. And that can be challenging because for most of the athletes that I've spoken with that struggle with that have been women, and they don't feel comfortable vocalizing their emotions to their parents. Because depending on cultural reasons and communities you come from, those are not conversations we're often granted to have, to tell a parent that we don't agree or we're not happy or we want to take a shift in what they projected for us. So that is, it just varies, but usually it's emotional. Usually it's emotional where they feel, and that also runs the risk of injury. When you're not mentally focused, that's how people get hurt. If you're not paying attention, like for volleyball, if your mind is somewhere else and you go up for a block and come down on your teammate's foot, you're not calling the ball. Like there's so many long, like immediate impact that we can have when we're not focused and we are basically checked out. So usually from what I've seen, it's emotional. That's a huge sign.
In regards to what you were saying a while ago, it's kind of in relation to the video you showed about vulnerability and just letting it happen rather than pushing it in. It's acceptance. You can have to let it happen rather than scoop it up and then it's just the building tension.
Absolutely.
I also have another in regards to another thing you mentioned. I found it interesting. If I'm not an athlete, I think it would be useful to other persons say that are not athletes. You spoke about regards to self-control, focus, and motivation. Can you mention a little bit more?
For focus that, I was trying to hear you a little bit. So focus on that for people that are not athletes with the playbook.
Well, you could say it in regards to athletes as well, but just a little bit on self-talk, because that was really interesting for me as an athlete, because everyone needs that kind of motivation.
Absolutely. No, yeah, I love that. And so about 4 years ago, I got into meditation, and not all, people think, oh, this is a whole nother situation. No, for me, meditation can be reading, meditation can be listening to music, meditation can be reading scripture, meditation can be going for a walk. And so what we have to find is that you have to center yourself in whatever way that looks like and be able to disconnect from life in a way that you become a priority. And that is so often so hard for the Black community, but also for Black men and Black women in their own right. And so I had to find a space in my life where I cared about my health more than I did work. where I cared about my health more than a paycheck, because survival mode is real, right? Bills don't stop and you want to perform at 100%. So no one can ever question your work ethic. That's how a lot of us are programmed. But once I started to pass out at work, I was in my early 20s with high blood pressure and was physically in the best shape of my life because I just, graduated, but I was going nonstop because as an athlete, I was expected to perform and execute, and you don't have time to gather yourself. You could have a bad day in class, but you still have to come to practice. You still have to show up to your game. I also come from a military family. So discipline and showing up and that camaraderie was just how I was programmed. No one, in my mind, it was no one cares if you have a bad day. You have to show up for the team, right? You have to be there. But that is definitely detrimental in real life. You have to show up for yourself. You can't show up for anyone else if you don't show up for you first. So when we talk about the playbook of being focused, of being motivated, you have to use those pillars and figure out what you need to strengthen yourself with. And even with the roles that we talked about, that applies to non-athletes too, to figure out what your role is in social circles, and are you giving more than you're receiving? One thing I can say in this doctoral journey that a professor told me that I honestly didn't really listen to and believe that would happen, well, she said, as you go through this journey, you will not be the same person on the other side. And you're going to have 3 types of people. You're going to have people that will walk with you through the process and just be an ear for you to vent. You will have people that will not understand what this is and who you're becoming, but they will wait for you on the other side and embrace you. And then you're going to have people that don't understand. They think that you're better than them. They think that you don't need them anymore, and all of the negative things that come with it because of what's going on in their life. And you are now an example of something they have not seen. And the journey there in their mind, doesn't necessarily include them. And so when I say I've experienced all 3 of those in a very short amount of time, it forced me to develop my own playbook. It forced me to evaluate the friendships. It forced me to evaluate how I was eating, how I was resting, and what the intention of my company was, and to make sure that I'm doing everything that God has asked me to do in this space. And so that was the big thing for me. So I'm very big, even when I ran groups for clients struggling with addiction. That's where I developed the playbook. And I had all of them with their 12 steps of recovery to use that playbook. And I would describe it as a house. You can't build a house on a foundation that is not solid. So in order to build a house, you have to go and look at the soil and make sure the soil is healthy and stable and strong and all of that. And then you build you put the concrete or whatever that is to make sure that you have the foundation. If that is not strong, which in our real life is our emotions, is our mental health. If that is not solid, anything else that comes on top of us is going to crumble, and we're probably going to crumble with it. It can be instant, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. But if that foundation is solid, meaning you are priority, you won't allow things to come on and to destroy it. And so that's how we have to navigate through life. And for some of us, that takes a very, very, very long time if you don't have the support system to do that. I've been out of school, undergrad, I finished my volleyball career in 2008, it's 2021. And I really developed and learned this journey about 6 years ago, and then I'm in my 4th year of my doctorate. So this again took education for me to learn. It took therapy for me to learn as well. So it's not a process that I believe people can do solely on your own. I believe you can be successful, but I believe that you need a support system as well.
Okay, so we have one last question in the chat, I believe.
Okay, do you see athletes just decide to give up on sports without any planning? How does that compare to those who plan their transition? Great question. I've seen both. In this day and time, because of COVID, we saw a lot of athletes that, just decided not to go back to campus because one, they felt it too safe. There's family members that had, extensive medical conditions and they just didn't want to take the risk and support them. So many different reasons why, but I'll say prior to the pandemic, you didn't really see athletes just stop playing. You would see more athletes transfer. And we obviously saw a spike in that too during the pandemic of athletes transferring to other universities. When it compares to those who plan their transition specifically out of sports, it usually is because they had the resources. It's usually because they had a mentor. They had folks that surround them and have been through that and understand the importance of that. So I'm an HBCU graduate. Bethune-Cookman University is an HBCU. And so I feel that even though at times I didn't necessarily get what I needed on the academic side, I was able to pull through and push through my depression because I had a community and an amazing Black woman who was my academic advisor, Dr. Kelsey, who made sure I needed to graduate, who helped me get a minor in social work. When you can think about other programs who are not going to suggest you things to be successful. Either you come to class or you don't. And so I'm always an advocate of HBCUs because it matters. So it honestly depends on how vocal and how much an athlete advocates for themselves. And so that's something we teach in our past programs, that we work with parents and the players to say, no one's going to help you if you don't ask for it. And even sometimes when you ask for it, they're not going to help you. So you have to know how to be relentless, how to be consistent, how to be vocal but professional, and then know how to move to another space if you're being tolerated, but not necessarily appreciated. And I'm very big on that as well. So it just depends and it varies. But the athletes that plan their transition is usually because they have a support system and they have mentors. Those that quit abruptly is usually because they've been going through something for a very long time and they've just burnt out with it and they've never had the support system and they leave. And those are athletes that back in the inner city communities that they worked so hard to get out of, but they had no path to leave. And I've experienced that with my own teammates that would tell me in college that if I don't get recruited and get this opportunity, I'm going to go back home and work at McDonald's and probably get pregnant. Like verbatim told me that. And unfortunately, that was their story. You know, they were not able to articulate, but really it's the institution's responsibility to understand these athletes and provide support to them. And it wasn't done. So several of my teammates didn't graduate college, and this was junior college. So this was undergrad, or this was an associate's degree. I can't speak to what they've done after, but in that moment, they didn't graduate and complete their degree because they were just an athlete and they didn't have the resources. And I was just a teammate. I didn't know how to do that. But great questions. Thank you for asking that. I hope I answered your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Holmes, for taking time out of your day and being our facilitator today. I'm sure all of us here really appreciate it, especially those of us in sport or find it interesting. I know I learned a lot. And I think you have so much knowledge of this. It's like, I really appreciate you coming out and being our facilitator for our 7th workshop. We'll keep this information, we'll share it with young women in athletes, and we'll be able to use this to help educate others. So I really want to thank you for coming in today and enlightening us.